Good afternoon, Prinhandar to you all, and thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to see that so many people have joined us. So, national parks, are they just places to walk? Are they just places to conserve, or places to research? Before I go on any further, I'll just introduce myself a little bit more. So, I am now the senior ecologist for climate adaptation at the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority. Prior to that, I had been an ecologist, a senior ecologist, conservation manager, natural resources manager. So I was really kind of ended up being in total control of kind of the countryside management services that we deliver as an authority. I've since stepped back from that role and now kind of doing a more focused role on climate adaptation. So let me just get the slideshow going itself, and then we'll kick off and be underway. So the kind of subclause to the title is this: in a post-Brexit era, post-COVID era, we're living in this nature and climate emergencies era as well. So what are the lessons that we can be learned and understood from how national parks are managed and the roles they can play? So if you have any understanding of national park management, I'd be pleased to hear your input about that in the kind of chat and Q&A session that follows. Those of you who don't understand or know where national parks are in Britain, that's just a distribution map. There are 15 of us throughout Scotland, England, and Wales. 2 in Scotland, 10 in England, 3 in Wales. The Peak District was the first national park to be designated in 1951. Snowdonia was the first to be designated in 1951 as well. Then Pembrokeshire Coast in 1952, and the Brecon Beacons National Park was designated in 1957. And the most recent national park to be designated to date is the South Downs back in 2010. There's always discussions about other areas that might be designated. The discussion waxes and wanes. In Wales, the Welsh 3 national parks cover an area of about 20% of the Welsh land area. And if you add the 5 areas of outstanding natural beauty to that total of designated landscapes in Wales, the area is about 25%. So about a quarter of the Welsh land mass is covered by designated landscape. Now, just this slide just emphasizes the fact that they are a legislative designation. They're not, national parks haven't been invented and people haven't made them up and just decided to draw lines on maps and declare themselves national parks. They are designated as a consequence of primary legislation. The principal piece of legislation is the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act from 1949, and the national park authorities that now govern national parks came into being following the Environment Act in 1995. So you can see there are clear purposes: a conservation purpose, an understanding and enjoyment purpose, and there's also a duty imposed on the governing bodies, the national park authorities, to deliver those purposes in ways that foster the economic and social well-being of local communities. Now, that's quite a challenge. Doing socio-economic development, you can do that. You could be an agency to do that. We're not an agency. We've got to conserve and restore habitats and species and cultural heritage in a way that fosters the social and economic well-being of people who live and work here. We've got to promote opportunities for understanding and enjoyment through that conservation, and we've also got to make sure that promotes socio-economic well-being as well. So that's actually quite a kind of philosophical challenge and quite a technical challenge as well. And we are kind of, the way we manage ourselves is, if you like, governed by the Category 5 management guidelines that were written by the IUCN, and indeed Place's own Professor Terry Marsden was one of the principal authors of those guidelines. And we've always felt that they read across very well indeed, and in fact we're ahead of their time. They read across very well to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the Environment Act, not least of all because of their emphasis on decision-making, local decision-making at the most local level possible, rather than through a top-down approach. And national parks are also governed and take our guidance from numerous policy statements that have been written following reviews. The most recent policy statement is the Welsh Government's own Valued and Resilient policy statement, expressing its priorities for areas of outstanding natural beauty and national parks. And that followed the National Parks Review commissioned by the Welsh Government, which Professor Terry Marsden led in 2014 and 15, and then a subsequent review of that review in 2016, which was led by Lord David Ellis Thomas. So we're here as a statute, we have a purpose, we have a clear role to play, but it's quite a complicated one. This is just a simple map illustrating quite how close the Brecon Beacons National Park is to Cardiff and Cardiff University. It's just 44 miles away. It's a 50-minute drive on a good day. It's an hour and a half, 2-hour drive on a bad day, depending on how bad the traffic is up at Mountain Ash. As you can see from that map, the national park is at the top of the heads of the valleys. It's at the top of the Cardiff City region, and interestingly, and kind of disappointingly, the Cardiff City region sort of an initial report only mentioned the Brecon Beacons National Park once, basically saying we frame the Cardiff City region. Well, there's an awful lot more benefit and value that the Brecon Beacons National Park plays to Cardiff than just framing it geographically. For example, as Welsh Water themselves will tell you, the national park supplies over 90% of the drinking water to Cardiff and the Newport area. It's an area of about 520 square miles, 1,347 square kilometers. And the land ownership is very interesting in the Brecon Beacons because very unusually, my employers, the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority, owns 14.7% of the land. We are actually the largest landowner in the national park, in this national park. It's very unusual. It's not the usual way of doing things. Natural Resources Wales owns just under 13%. Welsh Water and National Trust each own just under 4%. Sorry, I said Natural Resources was just under 13%, Welsh Water and the National Trust just under 4%. But 65% of the land is privately owned, and that's always an issue in terms of how, making progress. You've got to be able to negotiate and win hearts and minds the whole time to make progress in conservation and enhancement. 29%, or maybe nearly 30% now, is designated as SSSI and special area for conservation. There are no Ramsar sites, no SPAs in the Brecon Beacons National Park. And the registered commons, the registered common land in the national park makes up 35% of the land. It's the largest area of kind of extensive common in Wales, or that all falls within in the national park. And all of that, plus most of the Welsh Government's forestry estate, its coniferous plantations, are designated as access land as well. Population about 33,000. And the interesting facts to take from this list here is, I just wanted to emphasize that because it's common land, there's often a misconception about what common land is. Common land doesn't mean it's common to all and anyone can do what the hell they like on it and it's not owned and therefore it's just free land. It is a legal definition, common land. It is all owned, and the registered commoners, the graziers, have legal rights of grazing on the common. All that common land is now also designated as access land. So the right to roam exists across the entirety of it, but it's not wild and it's not wilderness. We don't have any of that in the Brecon Beacons. I would say we don't have any of that in Wales, probably very little of it in Britain. And just to make a point that, we have over 4 million visitors a year, but 3/4 of those, 75%, are day visitors. And that's an issue for the visitor economy as well. This map illustrates how the historic settlements have all really settled mainly along the River Usk and some other river valleys as well. And that is an important thing for us to bear in mind in terms of the cultural context of everything we do. The national park is quite a recent designation, but the historic patterns and sort of settlement patterns have been there for hundreds and thousands of years. So we have to tread very carefully when we're considering change. And actually looking at this map, it makes me realize, well, okay, national parks are a relatively recent designation, but in this Anthropocene, in this era of climate change and nature's collapse, which is also, they're also anthropogenic, designated landscapes are going to become increasingly important. We know that the IUCN, for example, has declared that it wants to double the area of protected areas around the world globally, terrestrially and oceanically. from about 16-70% to about 30% by 2030. And we know that the European Commission has already set that target for its revised biodiversity strategy. So national parks, and probably category 5 type national parks, are going to become increasingly important. So, maybe I'd say there's a nice piece of research, a longitudinal research to be gotten underway to see what sort of influence national parks might play, and as it is, designated landscapes might play as we move through this self-inflicted Anthropocene. National parks are governed by National Park Management Plans. That's a mandatory document. And we're currently preparing our plan for 2021 to 2025. We're a bit behind our own timetable, but obvious reasons last year, but we are catching up. And every national park authority in Britain, we are the local planning authority and the access authority for access land. And we're also one of Wales's 4 relevant authorities for implementing the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. So we have a rights of way improvement plan in this part because we also have a delegated agreement to run the rights of way, and we host a local access forum. Just a couple more features of interest as well about this national park. We designated the European Forest Fire Geopark in the mid-noughties, and I think 2 or 3 years ago, UNESCO accepted the Forest Fire Geopark into its global family of UNESCO global geoparks. So that adds, an increasing level of attraction, but also management complexity to how we have to deliver things here. And the Brecon Beacons, I think, was one of the first national parks in Britain to achieve international dark sky status. So the dark purple areas there, it might be showing blue on your screen, is the core area for the dark sky reserve. The kind of, whether it's pea coloured or fawn coloured on your screen, that is the buffer area for the international dark sky reserve. And the red line moving from west to east, east to west, is the Beacons Way, which is an upland and lowland trans park route, not a national trail, but a route that is specific to this national park. So I've given you a background which I think is essential for you to kind of try and understand the complexities within which we're working. How do we manage amidst all of this? Well, the first thing I think we have to accept is we're not in control. Most of the land is privately owned. There are other organizations at play as well. We have a management plan, but the management plan isn't just for us to implement, it's for all organizations to implement. And I would say it's for researchers to get involved and take an interest, because this is your national park as much as it's mine and as much as it's the National Park Authorities. All the national parks in Britain belong to you too. So you have a stake in how they're managed, and you should be taking an active interest in the kind of decisions we're making and the kind of planning we're setting out for ourselves in order to influence our future decisions as well. A lot of people still in the UK don't know what national parks are. Maybe you won't be surprised to know that we have frequent calls, people asking us, where's the entrance gate? How much do you have to pay to get in? And they do expect to see wolves and bears roaming the landscape. It's also, doesn't come as a surprise to us, but it does to some people, that a lot of people who live in this national park aren't aware that they live in a national park. Well, why would they? It's not our first concern when we wake up in the morning. There's more important things to be thinking about, especially right now. But most people's lives, we just get on with our lives, don't we? Where you live, you don't think, oh, okay, I live in Essex. That's the first thing I think about in the morning. I live in Paris. It's the first thing I think about in the morning. I live in a national park. Well, it isn't. Yeah, we are in this post-Brexit, nearly post-COVID lockdown, nature and climate emergency era, the Anthropocene, and we are, witnessing more or less on a weekly basis that our species is continuing to inflict self-inflicted harm on itself. I don't know if any of you caught the BBC Start the Week programme discussing on Monday this week, discussing the what I feel is a horrendous prospect for deep ocean mining for kind of nodules of precious metals, in order that we can have our fancy mobile phones and our PCs and our batteries in our electric cars, all of which I think are probably white elephants with a limited life expectancy on them. And yet we're about to do this, another great human folly, and which to me is, we're trying to do what we're trying to do in the national park. You're trying to do what you're trying to do in your professions, and yet we're having the carpet pulled from underneath our feet. And then not only the carpet pulled from underneath our feet, the floorboards are being ripped up, and the people are ripping the wiring out from underneath our feet as well, as they're trying to make money out of the natural world in a new way, apparently all in our name as well. So what should we be doing? What should we be focusing on? As a National Park Authority, we have a general intent to focus much more deeply on nature recovery, on addressing the impacts and consequences of climate change, both in terms of mitigating the impacts and adapting to the consequences, and for improving, kind of socially inclusive access to the countryside, in order to improve people's health and well-being and their active and healthy lifestyles. And we think we've got a rough idea of how we're going to do that, and we're looking for money the whole time. We've got our projects that are getting set up and underway, and we've got a small core of staff that we can develop some of this. And we're looking for kind of joint ventures and partnerships to maximise the numbers of bodies on the ground. But are we doing the right thing? Do you have a better crystal ball than we do? Are there other things that we should perhaps be focusing on? Well, if there are, please come and tell us, rather than just watching us maybe trip over our own feet. And these are some, this slide is just an example of the kind of strategic documents that we produce. The big blue ones is the previous National Park Management Plan. The pale blue one is just the preferred strategy for our local development plan, because we are the local planning authority. Our Nature Recovery Action Plan is called A Future with Nature at its Heart. And we have a Rights of Way Improvement Plan, and we have other plans as well. We're about to start developing a Historic Environment Action Plan for the conservation of the historic environment as well. But so what? We have all these plans. We're a small organization. We have 100 employees, only about 80 of which are full-time employees. And we have an awful lot of kind of mandatory responsibilities. So we don't have an awful lot of time for, if you like, what I call the kind of discretionary things that we need to do. We have some mandatory things we need to do, but the kind of inventing projects and devising projects, I kind of separate that out in my own mind as a discretionary thing, because we have so many mandatory things that we have to focus on the whole time. So the National Park Management Plan, the Local Development Plan, and the Rights of Way Improvement Plan are all mandatory. They have to be delivered by law. And that takes an awful lot of our resource. That's probably 70%, maybe nearly 80% of what we do is just spent on delivering those things. And in terms of managing the park and the resources, the human resources we have to do that, we have, a planning policy, a team for developing planning policy, for dealing with planning applications and developing place plans with the settlements in the park. We have a small ecology and biodiversity team focusing predominantly on nature recovery. I'm in that team focusing on climate adaptation. We have a team of 2 people dealing with all the rights of way legislation. And the wardens also cover the rights of way sort of maintenance requirements. We deliver countryside access improvements up in the uplands, upland paths, peatland restoration projects. We host the local access forum. We deliver Mars and Stars projects as well. Our warden service, if I hadn't said, it's just 12 people covering 520 square miles and thousands of kilometers of public rights of way. We have a small volunteer development team, but it's 1 person. An education team delivering education to primary and secondary schools. A sustainable tourism team, 2 people who are also pulled into the National Park Management Plan as well. They also deliver the Sustainable Development Fund, which is our grant scheme. We have a community development team, the same 2 people. And we have 1 geopark officer. We have a sustainable tourism team, 2 people. Well, in fact, 1.5 people. So we're very thin on the ground, and we're trying to do an awful lot. And this is an illustration of the kind of areas that I've been involved with and I'm still involved with. And I draw attention to the landscape character assessment, which is just a way for us to kind of assess different areas in the park in terms of their unique and unifying landscape character. I also draw attention to the research prospectus there that I produced in 2014 that our governing body, the National Park Authority, approved, and then that gave me the freedom to start developing strategic research partnerships, the first of which was developed with Place in Cardiff University. We also hold partnerships with the University of Wales, Trinity St David's, and with the University of South Wales, and we also have a lot of research collaboration with Swansea University, Bristol University, Reading University, and with Exeter University. We don't yet have partnerships with those because it's all about having enough brain space with those organisations to get those partnerships set up, and those are kind of mutually beneficial. And out of those have come research workshops and different outputs, and it's probably out of date, that figure 20 plus postgraduate and doctoral theses. I haven't looked recently, but it's probably closer to 30 now, with numerous undergraduate dissertations to boot. But what we haven't yet done is kind of assimilate that into a kind of nice piece of knowledge transferring and kind of nice literature review, so that people like me and other decision makers can actually know, okay, what is the summary intelligence coming out of this research that we can use to improve our decision making. Other things there, I'll just draw attention to the vital signs monitoring program. We've lifted that name, vital signs, straight out of the US National Park Service's rapid assessment and monitoring program. It's a program we hope to win grant funding for, to set up a series of permanent 1 kilometre survey quadrats across the park to go and take the vital signs of the park. The equivalent of its health status, its pulse, its blood pressure, its cholesterol level, and so on, so we can understand what state is the ecology of the park in. And with all this knowledge, we're amassing all this knowledge, but what we don't always have the time for is to pick through it and find those common threads, those common strands that kind of, if you like, the golden thread that we all like to talk about, that's going to help us, lead us to choose to do the right things and not keep focusing on some of the other things. Is really trying to find a way of bearing down on what's important. And in terms of a research context, which is why we have these strategic research partnerships, it's a discussion we've rehearsed several times with each other, is how to increase our joint capacity through partnerships and joint ventures. I have this vision of the Brecon Beacons National Park Authority being increasing its capacity as a consequence of its partnership with Cardiff University, and Cardiff University increasing its capacity as a consequence of its partnership with the National Park Authority. Similarly for University of Wales, Trinity St David's, and University of South Wales. And there's also a whole heap of facts and figures that I haven't given you today. I mean, just a few is the fact that this national park is hosts the largest breeding and hibernating colony of lesser horseshoe bats in Western Europe. And there are reasons for that, because of the beneficial planning decisions we've made, as well as some of the beneficial landscape improvements that have happened, and also as a consequence of very influential organisations like the Vincent Wildlife Trust. We have the largest extent of limestone pavement in Wales here. It's a very unique habitat. It's not an awful lot of it, but we have 70% of it in the national park. And we have the largest concentration of waterfalls within a small area in the UK, and some of the most numerous and longest and deepest cave systems in the UK. But I know bugger all about their ecology, and I'm dying for someone to come along who's got an interest in troglodytic flora and fauna and habitats. What a fantastic thing to find out about. Interestingly enough, the Monmouthshire and Brecon Canal is the most visited visitor attraction and route in the national park. So it's not the hills. In fact, through our own surveys, we found out that most people, the most popular walk in the national park is a lowland walk, not an upland walk. Now, that may surprise some people. Still, thousands and thousands of people take upland walks, but it's the Monmouthshire and Brecon Canal and lowland walks that are the most popular. And we saw what happened. You would have seen in the media what happened last year when the first COVID lockdown was released. It kind of led to masses of people visiting hotspots, and we saw the same thing happen here, and it completely, utterly, and totally overwhelmed us for about a month. We've since kind of figured out a way of managing that visitor pressure, but we're going to get that again this year, and it might become a permanent thing going forwards. how on earth are we going to manage? So this slide is just an example of the kind of thinking I've put into the National Park Authority now. It's not this approach has now been adopted and will feature in our next National Park Management Plan. It's kind of identifying 6 spatial areas across the park where we could develop strategic partnerships. The ones in green, apologies to anyone who has red-green color blindness, the most upper right-hand one and the 2 bottom leftmost ones are the green ones, and those are active partnerships that are underway already. So the Black Mountains Land Use Partnership, incorporating the Black Mountains in the east of the park. The Maithra Mynydd Advisory Group covers the Mynydd D area. Canure Estate isn't formally part of that Maithra Mynydd Advisory Group, but the Canure Estate does feature within the project area. That's kind of been here, just in this sort of area here. So the Canure Estate, which is the largest upland farm, I think, in Britain, would feature in that area if we got a strategic aerial partnership going there as well. Waterfall Country is another partnership. It may surprise some of you to know that the Waterfall Country receives millions of visitors each year, more visitors than NRW's set piece visitor attraction Coed y Brenin in the Snowdonia National Park. And there are 2 others that are awaiting partnerships: the Usk Valley, the Central Beacons, and the Llangors catchment. So this is how we're hoping to go forward in future, is to set up these kind of strategic partnerships that can act independently, allowing the National Park Authority to kind of free itself to reoffer its services on a voluntary basis, and people can accept those services or not as they see fit. But I also see this as potentially a good model for strategic research partnerships, offering their expertise into these different areas as well. So, given all of this and other stuff like the State and Natural Resources Report 2, Sonar 2, that Natural Resources Wales launched just before Christmas. That's another piece of information that we grapple with, guidance that we grapple with. Welsh Government's Natural Resources Policy and its advocacy for working with natural processes. The area statements that have been published under the Environment Wales Act. We have all this to do. We have all this to grapple with. We have all these sources of information to try and help us to channel our effort, but we're a small organization with a very small budget. And so we're trying to learn, but whilst we're delivering highly practical but time-consuming projects, but all of which we believe are on message, but all of which we believe would understand and would benefit from, all of which we believe would benefit from applied science, to understand and transfer the benefits of what it is we're achieving in order to improve people's lives and to spread the benefits into other aspects of countryside management as well. And among the kind of, if you like, research questions that we're asking are, where are the park's ecological hotspots? How do we enable more people to live and develop healthy, active lifestyles in a national park? What's the best way to achieve conservation of the historic environment in a changing climate, given that the urgent focus on sustainable land management for nature recovery and public benefits? The risk is we leave the historic environment behind in our urgency to think about, well, where can we put trees, peatland restoration, and so on. What level of visitor pressure should we be planning for long-term post-COVID lockdowns? What level of visitor pressure should we plan for following the recommendations from the Welsh Government's Access Reform Advisory Group, which will make recommendations for significantly increasing visitor access and use of public rights of way and the permissive of activities on access land? How can the tourism sector entice people to stay for longer, to spend more on the local economy, and from my point of view, to make a direct contribution to nature recovery and addressing the climate emergency? Is it good enough? Is it enough just for tourists to come and enjoy and not make a contribution? Does it mean we just have to keep on spending money to repair what's been damaged or eroded or frayed? and then they come back next year. Surely there should be a quid pro quo. What does a circular economy actually mean in a national park, where the ecological footprints are already so high because we live in a deeply rural area, and we're entirely dependent on inputs, on everything arriving by road or rail or being piped in or coming in over a wire? There's very little self-sufficiency in rural areas, and very little in this national park. And given our volunteers, our schools program, our research partnerships, our vital science project, the biological record centres, the park's local wildlife sites, place planning, what does citizen science mean amongst all of that in a national park? How can we, and what should we understand about the park's soils? And a supplementary question to that is, for the purposes of nature recovery and addressing climate change and sustainable food production and water resource management, is sustainable land management all about soils and water in an upland wetlands national park? Should we just focus on that? Have humans already occupied, changed, and subverted, and in some ways exterminated the best bits within the existing ecosystems? And are we now living with a marginalized natural world? And then are we actually calling those marginalized bits wildlife rich? And then kind of celebrating them as our jewels in the crown? Surely we as humans have already occupied the best bits, and what we're trying to work from is a very low base from which to recover. So that then asks the question, well, surely we're the problem, and it's us we've got to sort out. It's not about managing natural resources, it's human resources. It's not about ecosystem benefits, it's human benefits back to ecosystems. We've got to flip this round, and we've got to think about what can we do for nature, rather than keep asking the question, what can nature do for us? Come 2030, which is, if you like, the kind of nature recovery deadline and the real emergency in terms of addressing climate change, will anywhere, let alone a rural national park, actually be self-sufficient in anything at all? And a bit of a digression from the theme of national parks, but it's a hobby horse of mine. Are electric cars just a white elephant? Just an example of how we're kidding ourselves and fooling ourselves into assuming that we can just emulate our previously fossil fueled lives by getting renewable energy technologies to copy what fossil fuel technologies did for us. So this is an example of where a partner organisation, Dŵr Cymru Welsh Water, has actually, of its own accord, come up with a potential solution that can help us begin to navigate our way through some of these challenges. This map illustrates the catchments, the drinking water catchments around the reservoirs in the national park. Remember that 90% of the drinking water to Cardiff and the Cardiff City region and Newport comes from the national park. And Welsh Water has advised that 50% of the drinking water that it abstracts on a daily basis comes from the Brecon Beacons National Park. So it has identified the Brecon Beacons mega catchment by kind of pooling all those catchments together. And because it covers so much of the national park, effectively the entirety of the national park boundary is now identified as the Brecon Beacons mega catchment by Welsh Water. And the approach that they are advocating is that, well, we need to manage the landscape better in order to sweeten drinking water supplies, to take the cost out of end of pipe solutions, which are becoming prohibitively expensive. So a catchment management approach makes sense for this national park. Its biogeography tilts and drains southwards and eastwards with a kind of west to east oceanic influence as well. And the park is the top of the catchment, the source for at least 20 strategically important South Wales drinking waters, South Wales rivers, and includes at least 18 drinking water reservoirs and several lakes, including Wales's southernmost natural eutrophic standing water body in Llangolls Lake. And it has a host of organisations, large organisations like Natural Resources Wales, Welsh Water, the National Trust, and the National Park Authority, owning large tracts of land, including the Central Beacons. So there is potential for those organisations to work collaboratively. And this map, looking at this map, that one, And this is just an illustration of how the landscape designations, the triple SIs, which are in purple there, kind of overlap with those kind of catchments as well. And this map as well, it illustrates with this one the overlap between designations and water catchments and the distribution of peat across the park. Now, unfortunately, this is where it gets a little bit more difficult for us, but it also means, well, no, it doesn't make it more difficult for us. It highlights the priority that we are now giving to peatland restoration in relation to water management, but also in relation to landscape management, landscape recovery, and nature recovery. That this national park is, if you like, eroding peat central and drained peat central in South Wales and perhaps in Wales as a whole, if you look at this map. Because we have such a high concentration of eroded and drained peatland, we were, as a national park, as a landscape, this landscape's been, immediately downwind of the prevailing southwesterlies, blowing all that industrial pollution up from the coalfields and iron and steel works over the last 150 years. So there's an awful lot of atmospheric fallout onto the uplands. And you can see what a damaged peatland looks like. The top picture there is of a heavily hagged and drained peatland, and the bottom one is a close-up of the same sort of landscape that's also been damaged by fire, burning down straight through the peat, drying the peat out and getting down to the mineralized bedrock underneath it. And there's clearly a very clear relationship between peatland management and water management. So what is the cost in greenhouse gas emissions from this kind of eroding landscape? What are the water quality impacts from this sort of eroded landscape? What are the water retention impacts and potentials from actually restoring it? There's an awful lot of hyperbole out there and some published evidence, but we don't have an awful lot of published evidence. In fact, we have no published evidence at all of what restoring these landscapes will do for water quality and water retention. As we carry out the works. We're getting on with it. We're doing an awful lot of peatland restoration, but we don't have the capacity to run projects to tell us exactly what's happening. There is some postgraduate research underway now, looking at some of these impacts and some of these effects. And we are part of the National Peatlands Research Network that was set up under the Welsh Peatlands Project, that is looking to establish permanent research stations, permanent research quadrats on a number of upland sites, including the Brecon Beacons National Park. And we want to see, good long-term ecological studies get underway. We'd love to see the Ecological Continuity Trust engaged in this landscape. But we need joint ventures in order to make that happen. And we need researchers to take an interest and to start working with each other across institutions to start providing us with answers as well. And just as a kind of a closing conundrum, this is also something that is a live issue for us, especially at this time of year, as the spring arrives, people start setting the hills on fire. Arson, wildfires. This is an illustration of a controlled burn during a workshop that we ran with Natural Resources Wales to demonstrate to upland grazers how to do the job properly. 2 weeks after that, the entire hillside was set on fire, much to our disbelief, but that's what we're dealing with. And maybe the focus around wildfires, controlled fires has got to change. We know that, it's a potentially very controversial subject. We know experts such as Professor Stefan Duhr at Swansea University are grappling very hard to try and really look at the impacts of wildfire and wildfire ash on water quality. We sponsored a PhD looking at the impacts of wildfire on vegetation in the national park. But maybe I'm suggesting that maybe if we're going to keep on having to deal with wildfires, and the fire and rescue services are making valiant efforts every year. There's a national wildfire strategy for Wales. There are specialist fire and rescue teams that address this every year. We work collaboratively with them every year. We are looking to second a wildlife crime officer into the national park to International Park Authority to address this and other issues. But we're thinking that maybe, you know, the traditional reasons that you might have done controlled burning to kind of create a habitat mosaic, to kind of keep that kind of moorland habitat mosaic ticking over to create different aid structures and cycles, so that you can have a classic moorland habitat mosaic. That's still just a plagioclimate. That's kind of emulating the plagioclimates that was created for kind of game hunting reasons. So is that a valid reason to carry on at all? Or should we now be thinking about, well, we need to introduce controlled burning to actually take out the fuel load, so actually we don't see an entire mountain on fire, which has happened here in the national park. What, you know, we know there are catastrophic consequences for biodiversity, but we still don't know enough about the water quality impacts. We're learning more about the heavy metals that are in the vegetation in the uplands, and we know that as well as badly eroding peatlands, there's an issue around dissolved organic carbon getting into the water from any sort of fire. So we don't know quite where this discussion I've just given you is going to lead us, but we're not sure we can sit and do nothing, given the fact that grazing pressure is in decline in the uplands as well, as a consequence of more and more grazers retiring, the age profile of upland grazing, and it's just not being profitable enterprise once you take away common agricultural payments, which have now gone, and they're kind of in a ticking over mode for the next couple of years. So some concluding points. Are thematic and area-based partnerships a future approach for national park management? And is that also a future approach for strategic research partnerships? We're a very small organization. So should we all be looking to establish joint ventures to help organizations such as ourselves to manage national parks, and to persuade other organizations to get more involved in managing and looking after their national parks as well? And last few points as well, from what you've heard, or maybe not, what do we know that's useful to you? Equally important, what do you know that is useful to us? What should we be doing better in the national park? And equally important, what should you be doing better in your national parks? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was really, really interesting. We've got a couple of questions that have been put forward so far. So I'll start with those, and that'll give people hopefully a chance to kind of have a think and put forward some more questions. So the first question is, how accessible is the national park to disabled people?
That's a great question. It's getting better all the time. For several years, we've been running a Miles Without Styles project. The most important thing we've been doing there, under the auspices of the Local Access Forum, which, as I've explained, is a statutory forum under the Countryside and Rights of Way Act, is to remove stiles wherever we can. So we seek agreement with the landowner, usually the farmer, to replace the stile with a self-closing gate. Or to install kissing gates where those are possible, but actually self-closing gates are better, and that's been pretty successful. So there are entire mapped routes. We have 2 representatives from the disabled community sitting on our Local Access Forum, so they are integral to the work we do, but there's always more we can do. It's mainly a kind of capital replacement requirement, so it's about cost, and it's about labor, having the labor, and we can do as much as we can do with the time we have available each year. One thing we're concerned about actually is the recommendations that will be made by the Access Reform Advisory Group, because the way those might go, for example, is public rights of way, footpaths. Public footpaths, for example, are only accessible for pedestrians. If the recommendations come that they should also be accessible for cyclists and equestrian users, that's going to have a very different maintenance requirement on us, and it's going to have a very different furniture requirement on us as well. And all that furniture has to be installed with the permission of the landowner. And if the landowner sees that their land is getting more disturbed as a consequence of different users, that might start to queer the pitch in terms of our relationship management. So what we wouldn't want to see is all the good work we've achieved so far with putting in self-closing gates.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. It sounds like there's a lot of work's gone into that so far.
Yes.
That's brilliant. So there's another question around subsidies. So someone's asking, are the farmers and families living and working in the national park subsidised?
Well, they're not subsidised because they live and work in the national park. The subsidies that are available to any farmer who wishes to apply for them, provided they have, an agricultural holding number and their farm is registered with the Rural Payments Agency in Wales. So there's nothing special about farmers in national parks. It's the same for any farmer throughout Britain.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Someone else asking where the recording will be available. So it will be available on the Sustainable Places website on our events webinar pages, but I can add the link to the chat shortly as well, if that's helpful for people. So we've got another question now saying, you mentioned the canal is the most visited attraction in the national park. How effective are any existing partnerships you have in this area, specifically given the prominence of the area for tourism? And what are the challenges and opportunities you have in this context?
Okay, well, we have a pretty good working relationship with the Canal and Rivers Trust and also with Paris County Council. We are actually lined up this coming financial year, to actually deliver quite a lot of towpath improvements on behalf of the Canal and Rivers Trust, with funding coming through from Paris County Council. We tend to deliver quite a lot of that anyway. Our sustainable tourism team has also worked with different communities along the canal in kind of identifying kind of circular routes you can do in and out of the villages. And I think quite a few of our tourism businesses along the canal are also part of our tourist ambassador scheme. And that scheme is all about providing tourism providers with, if you like, a bit of a mastermind skill set on the features that are special about the national park, and especially what's special about the national park in their area. And just to say, also one of our strategic kind of guiding documents is the sustainable tourism strategy for the national park, and we've also convened the sustainable destination partnership, which I think is now being run by Brecon Beacons Tourism.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Paul. That's great. I was trying to make a note of these, but they're going past me. Okay, so another question saying, you mentioned the cost of visitors to the parks to yourselves. So how do you plan to balance this cost in the future, and would you introduce an entry fee to visitors, for instance?
You can't introduce an entrance fee to a national park when most of the land is privately owned, because if it was a national park in the same way that a category 1 or 2 national park is, like the Serengeti or Yosemite, those actually have veterinary fences all around them, and actually all the humans that used to live there were cleared off, which I think was catastrophic. And you've got a fence around them, and you have to pay a fee to go in. And you have shanty towns outside those kind of national parks. I don't think that's a sustainable way forward. The category 5 approach is much more working with the people who live and work here, and so we can provide kind of collaborative solutions. It's much more difficult that way because you don't have control. Everything has to be achieved through consensus. But you can't provide you can't charge an entrance fee to the park. Site owners can charge an entrance fee to their sites, but where a site is made up predominantly of access land, well, that's free and legally available to people anyway. So you can't charge a fee to people where they've got a legal right of access.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Okay, so another question saying, do you think that sticking to honeypot sites is the best option for sustainability, or should more be done to encourage people to walk in different areas of the park?
It's always a dilemma, that one. It's something that has exercised every national park authority, because in the kind of history of national park designation, we had to identify what are called is it category 3 maps? I can't remember what the term is. It's a map that we had to identify under the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which identifies our wilderness and remote areas. Now, I've already said there's no wildernesses in the national park, but that legislation still asked us to identify those. Now, that kind of wilderness and remoteness has actually been undermined completely by the proliferation of wind farms and wind turbines across the heads of the valleys and the South Wales valleys, because the whole point about remoteness and wilderness is you shouldn't be able to see in your vista any signs of human habitation or impact. And from vistas looking into the park, that shouldn't be interrupted either. But obviously with the proliferation of wind turbines, that's been completely changed. Now, in terms of honeypot sites, yeah, we have about half a dozen of them. That's where most people go anyway. Yes, probably there's going to need to be more investment made into those areas, but we've got to think really carefully about that. We are the local planning authority, so anything we propose or partners propose has to go through the rigors of our planning process, and it is an unforgiving process as it is anywhere else in Britain. But we don't make any excuses for applying the environmental constraints approach to our planning decisions in a national park. Why the hell wouldn't we? That's exactly what we should be doing. So, if we're going to be putting in bridges or paths or steps or new visitors centres or putting down harder surfaces, those all have costs. Those all have environmental costs. And eventually they have maintenance costs as well. And they also have an impact on the people who don't want that change. It's a difficult line to navigate. But I would say, yes, there's probably some key sites where more needs to happen. We're looking very hard at Waterfall Country. You saw that as one of the strategic strategic area partnerships. Anyway, we are looking to take that to a higher level with the unitary authorities, with Rhondda and Taff, Powys County Council, Neath Port Talbot, with Natural Resources Wales and ourselves, to kind of up the ante there to try and get some higher level, deeper solutions that are going to last for a longer time there. Areas like the Central Beacons, well, the National Trust has a planning application in anyway to improve car parking facilities there, and we're looking to look at options there for improved information. We've already kind of worked with the Welsh Government and Visit Wales on its Wales Way promotional route along the A470 all the way from Cardiff all the way up to Conwy. So there is more happening there. In terms of pulling people away and putting them into less remote areas, well, there's a limit to how much you can do with that, because the kind of remote areas are the west of the park. The Forest Fire Geopark is really the remote area in the park. There are no roads. You can only really walk into those places anyway. You don't want to build new facilities there. We would never give ourselves planning permission for that, I'm sure. So it's going to be a case of making the existing places as good as they can be, I think, and then accompanying that with as much information and education and awareness raising as you can without hectoring and lecturing, so to speak.
Thank you, Paul. That's great. We've got quite a few questions left, so we'll go through a few, maybe go a couple of minutes over, but if there's any that we don't manage to get to by the end, then I will, I'll save those and we can send them to Paul, and maybe Paul.
Okay, I'll answer them, I promise.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so the next question says, Brecon Beacons will be a key part of dealing with anthropogenic impacts by increasing human-nature connections. Could you say more about managing visitor pressure and how you envisage the public can play a greater role in stewarding the park areas?
Good question and a good approach. Yes. Well, I'll start answering that from where we were with the lifting of the first COVID lockdown back in, when was it? Was it July? Well, by September, we were completely overwhelmed. Our wardens team was knackered, really knackered from what they've been having to cope with, because actually throughout the lockdown, we have been dealing with ridiculous numbers of people coming to the park anyway, people coming from as far afield as Northumberland and London or Birmingham or wherever on a day trip to Waterfall Country, and the police just turning them around and sending them back home with a flea in their ear and their number being monitored and a fine when they get home. So we know more of that is going to come in future, but the dilemma is the national park is a living and working landscape. People live here. It's not predominantly. It's not either visitors or residents. It's got to be both. And hotspots, for example, like Waterfall Country, where visitor pressure really, my heart really goes out to people who live in Waterfall Country, because sometimes the visitor pressure is, as a resident, must be utterly intolerable, with people parked up across your driveway so you can't get your own car out, people coming and knocking on your door asking if they can fill your water bottle, people getting undressed in the street, all sorts. It's not nice. And in fact, there are some very patient people who live in that area, for example, who know when it's going to be a crowded bank holiday weekend, or as soon as the sun shines, they know people are going to arrive. They actually go and park their car somewhere else and then walk to and from their house in their car in order that they can carry on living their lives. That's intolerable. I don't think, I wouldn't be very happy with that happening outside my front door. And I expect people attending today wouldn't either. So we have to kind of take people with us who live here. So, but you can't force people to want to be involved in the visitor economy if they don't want to be. So in those hotspots, yes, there's going to have to be an awful lot of deep work done, and it's going to have to take time to see if we can kind of find those lines of least resistance, so those people who are willing to work. Now, one of the ways we're looking at that is as I mentioned briefly, we do our place planning, and that's a policy process led through the local development plan, where we work with our key settlements to develop a place plan, a community plan going forwards on what sort of developments they'd like to see for their area within environmental constraints, and kind of creating a kind of sustainable master plan, a blueprint for their settlement. So we already have a finished plan for Hay-on-Wye. I think Crickhowes might be nearing completion. Breckham's is in progress. There's one being thought about for Sennybridge, and others being thought about elsewhere as well. And through that approach, we might be able to see if we can, get more national park ambassadors, if we can get people to become champions of, what about water quality champions living there? What about nature champions drawn from the local population? What about visitor champions who just who really like visitors and just want to start running their own initiatives? But you can see with every single one of those things, you're going to need a resource. You're going to need a project officer. You're going to need an expert of one sort or another to do all that work. I can't just sit here and say, go and make that happen. And neither can anyone else. It all requires work, and it all requires time. I could go on for hours about this, but I think I better let another question be asked.
Well, the next question actually follows on quite nicely from that. So someone's asking to what extent the honeypot sites are under the park ownership, or do they largely represent other landowners?
They mainly represent other landowners. So the honeypot site is obviously Pen y Fan, and the nature of visiting to that has changed hugely with social media. It really is a case of, it's on people's tick list now to get that Instagram photograph of yourself up by the cairn on top of Pen y Fan, and then you walk back down and go and drive off. The local economy has benefited absolutely nothing from that visit at all. Might be some litter left behind that we have to clear up. Mostly not. Most people are very good, but it's a few individuals that make all the difference in terms of litter. And the place is, National Trust, when I first arrived here, was just about completing all its footpath restoration and erosion control work, and it's all been completely undone by the huge amount of visitor pressure up there again. Like I said, they're looking at installing car parks, and they'll be looking to take a fee off the car park, which they can then plough back into managing the area. The Sugarloaf, also owned by the National Trust. Sgurydvar and Sgurydvach are also owned by the National Trust. Garanant Visitor Centre is owned by Natural Resources Wales. We own the National Park Visitor Centre, the Mountain Centre up by Mynyddylltyd. Llyn-y-Fan-Fach is owned by Welsh Water. And the Black Mountains, they're just a big area of mountains, are owned by private estates and grazed by graziers. So a mixed picture, but we don't tend to own very much of that. There's also the gunpowder works in Waterfall Country that we own, that we've just completed a Heritage Lottery funded project on. But most of our the parks of hot visitor attractions, hotspots, are owned by other people, other organisations.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We've probably got time for maybe one or two questions, and then the rest, as I said, if Paul hasn't got your question yet, then we will. I'll send them to Paul at the end, and we can address them. So the next question says, I was wondering about working relationships with land managers for habitat restoration. What does collaboration with farmers look like on the ground? Ooh, I've just lost half the question. Wait 1 second. Yeah, sorry about that. So what does collaboration with farmers look like on the ground? Are there insights that can provide and can help support habitat restoration, or are upland farming practices inherently damaging?
Okay, Several answers to that. The first one is we have a local nature partnership that supports the Nature Recovery Action Plan. That includes the willing organizations out of all the kind of conservation organizations you can think of. Some of them are more active and more participative than others. So that's kind of focused on implementing the Nature Recovery Action Plan, which includes objectives and actions for upland management and farm management and so on. In terms of our direct working relationship with farmers, well, that's been very heavily influenced by our land ownership. We own 20,000 hectares of the national park. We are the largest landowner in the national park, which is a very odd state of affairs. And most of that is upland registered common land. So I'd say we are an expert organization in working relationships with registered commoners and in the management of common land. And on the whole, we have pretty good working relationships with the commons associations that we work with. We don't work actively with all of them because we just don't have the resources to work with all of them. So we have to kind of choose for strategically important reasons which areas we're going to focus on. But yes, there are two prime examples of very successful approaches of working with upland graziers. Is one, the Maithra Mynydd Advisory Group. Now, Maithra Mynydd means care of the mountain. That was a phrase invented for the Maithra Mynydd project, which was, I think, the European Life Fund's first upland project implemented either in Britain or even in Europe. It was before my time, which was looking at integrated upland management for all the different commons that make up Mynydd D and the Western Great Forest. That led to the advisory group. That's led to a number of kind of historic environment restoration projects. But actually, the early stages of it, we were still dealing with very heavy grazing pressure that was being encouraged through Common Agricultural Policy payments. More recently, with the advent of the Glastier Common Land Scheme, because we happen to be the landowner, we were able to work very collaboratively with the Glastier contract officers from Natural Resources Wales and with the graziers, to the extent that we ended up with 6 Glastier Common Land Associations being established throughout most of the Mynydd D Massif, with us setting up service level agreements with the graziers. They got paid, and then they paid us to deliver the works, because most of the works they weren't legally entitled to deliver, things like controlled burning, peat restoration, bracken control, heather mulching, and kind of historic sheepfolds and other things being repaired. They didn't have the rights to do that because commons rights are quite limited. So it was a win-win situation for us. They got the payments, then they paid us. So we got to deliver the land management to our satisfaction and to our standards. The other example would be the Black Mountains Land Use Partnership, which, if you like, these two partnerships bookend the park. The Black Mountains Land Use Partnership on the east of the park, funded by the Welsh Government's Sustainable Management Scheme under the Rural Development Programme, was the largest scheme of its type in Wales that established an integrated land management partnership. You can Google Black Mountains Land Use Partnership and go and see for yourself the outputs from the project, but that involved representatives from the Graziers Association, the private landed estates, ourselves, Welsh Water, Natural Resources Wales, and Natural England as an observer, because obviously the Black Mountains crosses the Welsh-England border. So yeah, there was a lot of success there, and the Welsh Government is following both those projects very closely to see how it can devise its own sustainable farming scheme going forwards. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. Saying thank you, that's really interesting. We'll do one more question, and then, as I said, we'll address the others later. So final question then says, is too much emphasis placed on landscape character and the way a landscape looked or natural beauty in a world that urgently requires some significant changes in land use?
Yeah, great question. It's a very philosophical question, isn't it? Because obviously, designated landscapes, national parks were designated for what they looked like back in, they were identified under the Dow Report back in the 1940s, and they were designated from that point onwards based upon that physiognomy. So what we're talking about there, the landscape character assessments, what we see is land cover, but what we have to recognize underneath that is land form. And landform processes, which are geological and geomorphological, and with the influence of meteorology and ecology on top of that. The land cover side of it is all kind of anthropogenic. So yes, and that's going to change. it's clearly going to change. But the landscape character assessments aren't done in order to set things in aspic. We have to do these assessments in order for us to give us any sort of context in order to make any sort of decisions at all. For example, planning decisions or landscape change decisions. You have to have a baseline from which to work. So I wouldn't want people to think landscape character assessments are all there to whip us across the back and say you can't change anything. It's just to enable us to kind of unify and understand what it is we're looking at. We've actually just commissioned, we're waiting for the final version of a report from Reading University on future landscapes in the park, and they're proposing an approach looking at the strength of landscape character and the strength of landscape condition with a methodology to boot. So, and that would be a process that's designed to help us let things change. But, you know, we don't know what direction the change is going to go in. You know, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what change that goes in.
Thank you, Paul. That's a really interesting question to end on. And yeah, lovely. Okay, well, I think we'd probably better call it time there. I know people have got other meetings to attend. So thank you very much to Paul again for joining us, for speaking today. It was really interesting. And thank you to everyone for all of the really interesting questions. It was a really interesting discussion. So as I said, we'll make this available on the Sustainable Places webinar pages within about a week or so. And if you've got any follow-up questions for Paul, or you want contact details, then please do let us know. We'd be happy to put you in touch. So yeah, okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and afternoon.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks for
Bye-bye.